So Shaman has been a pretty good class for a while. At the beginning of Journey to Un'Goro, people thought it was bad, and then people realized it's actually one of the best classes because Bloodlust OP. And it seems like maybe Blizzard is not that big a fan of Bloodlust because I don't think that deck really got too many new tools this expansion. But what did get new tools is Murloc Shaman, starting with Burrlock, 2 mana 2/2, Battlecry freeze an enemy. So it's like Glacial Shard, except you get 1 more health and a Murloc tag for 1 more mana. And I think a lot of people interpret that as a bad thing, 1 mana for +1 health and a Murloc tag. But the Murloc tag is really valuable. Compare it to Beast or Dragon, it's probably by far the most valuable tribal tag. And the jump from 1 health to 2 health is probably the most significant health jump in the game. So I think this card is pretty fair at 2 mana. It has synergy with all these new freezing effects the Shamans are getting in this expansion. Spoiler alert, I don't think that's going to pan out too well. So I'm mostly expecting this card to see play in a Murloc Shaman deck. And why would you play Murlocs in Shaman? Well, the next card, Ice Fishing, is a Murloc card. They've got a quest dedicated to Murlocs, and this might be pretty good in that. It's also just like a thing you can play on turn 2 and not die to Fiery War Axe or Jade Claws or whatever, and it helps you get your Murloc Snowball going. Or later in the game, if they have something on the board threatening your Murlocs, you can just give them a big old middle finger, freeze their dude, and keep playing Murlocs. It's a way that if you get slightly behind on board, you don't just instantly lose as a Murloc deck. So it could be pretty nice. Not sure this really solves any of the problems that Quest Shaman has, and that is playing a tempo or aggro deck that you have to give up your turn 1 for. But maybe a non-quest Murloc Shaman could be a thing. Murloc's got some pretty broken cards in Journey to Un'Goro, and Shaman uses them just as well as anybody. Well, not just as well, because they don't have an OP 1-drop Murloc, unlike Paladin, but they can still put them to pretty good effect. But yeah, basically card seems okay in a Murloc Shaman, probably not outside of that. And obviously this card also doesn't see play outside of Murloc Shamans. Ice Fishing, draw 2 Murlocs from your deck. So the thing about Murlocs is, in the early turns you kind of want to spend all your mana putting Murlocs on the board, and if you're spending 2 mana playing Ice Fishing, you're not putting Murlocs on the board, so that's kind of a bummer. But if you're playing Quest Shaman, that's kind of a slower Murloc deck, you're not trying to snowball as hard, this card would be really good in there, since you do just need to find your Murlocs to finish the quest. If you are playing a more typical Murloc deck, this can help you refuel in the late game when your Murlocs are off the board, but at that point, once your snowball has been stopped, you're kinda not going to win, but if you're playing Burlock, then you can freeze some things and try to get yourself back on the board, which might be a thing. You could also play this in a deck that just plays the Finja package with 2 Bluegills and 2 War Leaders, and it helps you find your Finja. Even if you draw your other Murlocs, they still have synergy. I guess that's another thing to mention. This is 2 mana, draw 2 Murlocs, and when you're drawing 2 Murlocs, Murlocs tend to have synergy with each other, so they're pretty good cards to draw 2 of at a time. So yeah, card seems pretty solid if you're playing a Murloc Shaman that isn't like all-in aggressive. I don't think it's enough for Murlocs to really be creeping into other Shaman decks, but basically if you're playing Murlocs, it's probably a good card. Drakari Defender, 3 mana 2/8 taunt with a downside, just like Deathlord, OP. Except the difference between this and Deathlord is this is always giving you the drawback the turn you play it, or I guess the turn after you play it. With Deathlord, sometimes the opponent didn't get the minion out of it for several turns, so it was a lot less punishing for the drawback to happen on like turn 6 instead of on turn 4, like this guy is always going to hit you on. He is still a 3 mana 2/8, which is a very strong stat line, but I think the fact that you're going to have 1 mana on turn 4 pretty much makes this unplayable. Maybe if we still had Tunnel Trog, this card would be good, but in that case you'd probably rather play Feral Spirit. And even without the Tunnel Trog, it seems like you'd probably rather play Feral Spirit. It splits up the bodies in a way that makes more sense with Bloodlust or Flametongue Totem or whatever. So even though Flametongue Totem is pretty damn good on Drakari Defender, probably still better when combined with Feral Spirits. And even though this guy has a lot of stats, he does only have 2 power. On turn 3, that's not even necessarily going to be killing everything it's fighting. So basically, long story short, that's probably too much overload for how many stats you're getting out of this. Voodoo Hexer. Damn, this card seems good. So it's got the Ally Armorsmith stat line, except instead of gaining armor, it just freezes the things that touch it. As a 2/7, it's probably not killing too many of the things that it goes into combat with, so freezing them is pretty valuable. Most of the time, if you freeze something for a turn, that's going to mitigate at least 2 damage on the following turn. So compared to Ally Armorsmith, the healing is probably pretty comparable, if not better. 5 mana 2/7 on its own is a pretty reasonable stat line. Even if you don't kill the things, like I said, you freeze them, lock them out of the game for a turn, or you can just combine this 2 power with all the ridiculous AoE that Shaman has. So you deal 2 damage to all their 3 health things, and then you just Maelstrom Portal those whenever you feel like it. Card is just really, really solid. It also just straight up beats Pirate Warrior sometimes, because you can just lock out their weapon. The only reason I'm not going to call this a 5-star card is because I'm not really sure how easy it's going to be to work into Shaman decks. Things like Elemental and Jade Shaman have to dedicate a lot of deck slots to synergies, and things like Bloodlust Shaman may not want this card, although 5 mana 2/7 does protect all your tokens. Pretty good with Flame Tongue Totem. I don't know, there's also the potential this is just a 2-of in every Shaman deck. I think that's definitely a very real world. Icebreaker, that's a 3 mana 1/3 weapon, but if the thing you hit is frozen, it gets destroyed. But how easy is it to freeze things in Shaman? Well, with Voodoo Hexer, I guess it's pretty easy. But in that case, you've already dealt 2 damage to the thing you want to execute, and then you're dealing a 3rd to it with Icebreaker, so how much value are you really getting out of the text on this card? Maybe not too much. Pretty hard to justify playing like a Frost Shock with this. Maybe Avalanche with this is okay. I don't really want to combo this with Cryostasis because it's still an expensive execute type effect, and I'm even taking 3 more damage because of it. I guess this card does work pretty well with Warlock, but I'm not sure that card really wants to see play outside of Murloc decks. I'm not sure if Icebreaker is really wanting to see play inside Murloc decks. It kind of seems to me like the whole freeze mechanic in Shaman is just not going to take off, but if it does take off, this card is probably quite strong. Avalanche. So you get to freeze one thing and kill 2 other things. The thing you freeze doesn't take any damage, which I guess is fine because you want to smack your Icebreaker into it. But it seems like kind of a weak card on its own. If it ever becomes meta for Freeze Shaman to be a thing, this card is super easy to play around. Like probably even easier than Meteor or whatever. They just put their best freeze target on the end, and then if you have to freeze a Bittertide Hydra or something, you're only getting to kill 1 minion with this. And then you're like strapping a Dark Bomb and a Freezing Potion together. Or I guess in some ways you can kind of look at it as a Frostbolt, but it costs 4 mana, it's just really inefficient. If you're just trying to use this as AoE, Shaman has like 10 other better AoE spells. Seems hard to justify. Cryostasis. So this is a spell that targets a minion, and when you target that minion, it does a good thing and a bad thing to that minion. So the bad thing is you freeze it. I guess you want to freeze your opponent's minion to lock it out of the game for a turn. But if you're freezing your opponent's minion and giving it +3/+3, when it comes back into the game, it's even bigger and harder to deal with. And the reason you froze it in the first place is probably that you couldn't deal with it. I guess you can Icebreaker into it now, but you're using a really inefficient combo of cards to kill a single thing, and you're taking at least 3 damage from that combo. So the Cryostasis Icebreaker combo doesn't really look that appealing to me. If you want to target your own thing with this, you give it +3/+3 for 2, which is great, especially if you compare it to like Blessing of Kings or something, but you're freezing it for a turn. Most of the time when you want to play a buff card on a minion, it's because the stats that you're buffing effectively have charge, because when you're buffing the minion you can attack with it that turn, and with Cryostasis you can't really do that, so the buff inherently is worth a little bit less than you might expect. You can target like a taunt minion, assuming that your opponent's going to swing into it. You don't really need the charge out of it. You could target like a Lana'thel totem or a Flame Tongue totem or something to make it harder to kill, but generally it's a bad idea to pump stats into a minion if you're not getting some value out of those stats this turn. So like you very rarely just play Blessing of Kings on one of your dudes and pass the turn, because if you do that and that minion gets removed with Vilespine Slayer or Hex or whatever, then you just got 2 for 1 and got no value out of that stat buff. And Cryostasis basically always leaves you open to that. So basically it's not very good at dealing with an opponent's thing, it's not very good at buffing your own things. It offers you some flexibility, but I think you pay a lot for that flexibility. I don't think this card is very good at all. Probably not even playable in the Icebreaker deck, honestly. Maybe 2 stars is even generous. I think Cryostasis sucks. Snow Fury Giant. So the most notable thing about this card is it's the first 11 cost minion. So now when your Yogg-Saron casts Evolve, it actually evolves into this and stops casting. If your opponent plays Arcane Giant, it can now be devolved, which I guess is probably bad for the Shaman player in most instances, since if it's damaged, it's just going to become an 8/8 again. and if it's not damaged, it's just going to break even. So the evolution factor is definitely a thing. This guy costs less each time you overload a mana crystal this game, and that is per crystal, so if you play your Drakari Defender, this guy gets his cost decreased by 3, which I guess could be pretty nice. A lot of Control Shaman decks play a Jinyu Water Speaker for a 1 mana discount on this guy. They play Lightning Storms and Volcanoes. There are a lot of overload cards that can end up in Control Shaman decks, particularly in the lists that play like Ancestral Spirit and Earth Elemental. I think this card would have a pretty nice time finding a home in those lists. It is a little bit of a concern that those decks never played Arcane Giant, and in some sense Arcane Giant and Snow Fury Giant are pretty similar. But I think in a Shaman deck, it's typically going to be a little bit easier to decrease the cost of the Snow Fury Giant, and it does start at 11 instead of 12, so you have to play 1 less overall to get it to a reasonable spot. This guy is also an Elemental, and Shamans do have Elemental synergy. So maybe you don't even need to play it in the Ancestral Spirit list, maybe you just play it in an Elemental Shaman that plays, you know, Calamos and Tar Creepers and that kind of stuff. Or maybe you make like a hybrid list between those. I think this guy will probably see some play somewhere. Now for the Shaman's regular legendary card, Murabi. Whenever another minion is frozen, add a copy of it to your hand. It's a 4/4 for 6, so you definitely need to be getting some value out of this text, and I think it's going to be pretty difficult to get value out of this text. Most of Shaman's freezing effects, other than Voodoo Hexer, are pretty inefficient, not very strong, and I think because this card on its own is so bad, you probably do need to be getting multiple freezes with this card just to get the value out of it. Shaman doesn't have access to Blizzard or Frost Nova or anything like that, so I think it is going to be pretty difficult to get the value out of this guy. There's a neutral minion which freezes all friendly minions, which I guess could sometimes get some pretty good value with this, but in that case you're probably better off just playing Spirit Echo. It just seems like for what this card is, it's way too hard to get enough value. So basically I think Murabi is hot garbage. Thrall Deathseer is the new Shaman Death Knight card. So when I first saw this guy, I was like, holy shit, this card is broken. It's a Death Knight for 5 mana. It just goes into current Evolve Shaman lists. But I think I've been convinced that this card is actually not even very good. Most Shaman decks play at least Flametongue Totem, and they typically have other synergies that come with their hero power. The popular list that a lot of people want to throw this in, those lists play Bloodlust. And a lot of the threat of playing a Shaman deck like that is that you can continuously generate minions with your hero power. So when you get the Transmute Spirit hero power, you can no longer do that. And the single target Evolve hero power is a lot less reliable when you don't have a hero power that can just generate minions for you to actually use it on. And because your hero power is no longer generating minions, you do have a finite amount of minions in your deck now. If you run out of minions, this is obviously a terrible hero power. And also, like, if you evolve your 5-drop into, say, a Karen Bloodhoof, and then that Karen Bloodhoof is your only minion, like, you're not going to Transmute Spirit that, right? So it seems like a lot of times, even if you have a minion, this hero power might not even be that good. So at least in the current Evolved Shaman deck that sees play on ladder right now, I think this hero power is actually a downgrade. But the battle cry is really strong. You get to evolve your minions by 2 instead of 1. Most of the reason that Evolve sees play in the current Bloodlust Shaman deck is because of Doppelgangster. And the thing with Doppelgangster is, once you've played it on the board, all the 2/2s are basically 1 mana minions. They're basically Enchanted Ravens. So when you cast Evolve on those and they go up to 6 mana minions, you get like a 5 mana point swing out of that. But then if you evolve them up to 7 cost minions, that's only like a 6 mana point swing. So in the case of Doppelgangster, playing a double evolve is actually only marginally better than evolving them once, just because the gap from 1 to 6 is much more significant than the gap from 6 to 7. Now in that deck, this battlecry is probably a lot better with your Fireflies and random Pirates and Totems and stuff. You get 2 drops, or you get 3 drops instead of 2 drops. But at that point, this card puts you really all in on that board, and if that board gets removed, you're probably in trouble. So I think in current Shaman builds, this card is actually pretty counterproductive to their overall game plan, and the only way it's going to see play is if the initial battle cry is often enough to just win the game on its own, and I don't suspect it will be. Also worth noting, the 5 armor in that deck is pretty much irrelevant. So I guess you want to try to play this in a more traditional Evolved Shaman, something with Master of Evolution and, I don't know, Nerubian Prophet or something like that. In the past, that deck has been pretty weak, but maybe with the consistency of this hero power, you can make it work. But even in those decks, I think you probably are going to miss your totem hero power, and I'm not sure that those decks really have too much merit over Elemental Shaman or Jade Shaman or Token Shaman. This does help with the consistency of that deck, but I don't think it really solves the problems with that deck, which is basically that sometimes you play Evolve and you get a lot of garbage. You can try to evolve them again with your hero power, but you can only hero power once per turn, so I don't know. I think this is actually one of the worst Death Knights. Overall, I don't think Shaman got too much. If the freeze mechanic pans out, then I guess they got some pretty nice stuff. But as things sit, I think Snow Fury Giant and Voodoo Hexer are probably the only cards that they'll play. If Murloc Shaman takes off, then they get a few more tools. There's definitely a very real potential that I'm wrong about the Death Knight, but I just suspect it's probably not very strong. I don't think Shaman got too much, but Shaman's been OP for like over a year now, so that's probably fine. So Warlock has always been pretty good, until Journey to Un'Goro when it's a complete dead class. So I guess anything they get can't be too bad, right? Sanguine Reveler. So this is like a zoo card. If you get its Battlecry to trigger, it's a 1-mana 3/3. You can use this with like Possessed Villager, or you play Bloodsail Corsair and then coin this out and eat your patches, which is actually pretty strong on turn 1. You get a 3/3 and a 1/2. You can also use this to combo with Devilsaur Eggs, that kind of stuff. The problem I have with this card is if you're eating anything other than a 1/1 or like a Devilsaur Egg, it's not very good value at all. If you compare it to Flame Imp, which Warlock already has access to, that's a 3/2 where you don't have to kill another minion. Of course, that extra point of health is pretty relevant, but you do have to pay a lot to get that extra point of health. And I'm not sure that there are really enough Devilsaur Egg type cards to really justify the inclusion of this. But it is a zoo card. Zoo is not that far off from being good. If you do hit a Devilsaur Egg or exactly a 1/1 minion, this card can actually be pretty strong. And much to my surprise, and I think the surprise of many people, the card Reliquary Seeker, which was also a 1-mana 1/1, gained some stats eventually. That card actually ended up seeing play. So I'm not ready to count this card out, but I'm not sure that Zoo really got enough tools to be viable in this set. But if it is viable, I can see a world where Sanguine Reveler has a spot in that deck. Owl Fiend. So I think this card is actually pretty good, and it's being super underrated. It's a 3-mana 3/6 demon, which is a very, very good stat line for a Zoo deck. And let's just say this up front, you're never playing this anywhere outside of Zoo, because outside of Zoo, discarding the cards is actually a drawback. But if you're playing this in Zoo, on turn 3 you get a 3-mana 3/6, which is sick. In Zoo, all you want is things that have good stats on the turn you play it. So if you compare this to some of the other discard cards, you actually don't even have to discard the turn you play this, which is sometimes pretty nice. People see that this guy has 6 health and you discard a card every time it takes damage, but you're never actually going to discard 6 cards with this like people seem to think you are. At most, I think you're going to discard 3. Most of the time, I think you're probably only going to discard 2. And if this thing gets fireballed or hexed or something, you're going to discard 1 or 0 cards with it. And the thing is, even if your opponent does have the means to deal 6 different instances of damage to this, as a Zoo player, am I really upset about that when I have my 1-drop and my 2-drop on the board? I don't think so. If they're just sinking their entire turn into making me discard, then my 1 and 2-drop are just going to beat them to death. And against Zoo, if you see this guy on the board, you haven't seen a Silverware Golem yet, do you really want to make them discard their entire hand? Sure, you might get rid of something that they wanted to play next turn, but you also might be staring down a 3/3 that can attack next turn. So I don't think this card is nearly as bad as some people seem to think. I've seen people say that this is like literally the worst minion ever printed, and that's just not true. I think if Zoo is viable in Knights of the Frozen Throne, this card will be part of it. I actually wouldn't be that surprised if this card saw play in a deck that didn't have discard synergy. Because it's a 3-mana 3/6, and if you're playing Zoo, they still have to be worried about the Silverware Golem even if it's not actually in your deck. And even if they do make you discard your whole hand, then you still have life tap, you can just life tap and play more cards. In the late game, this is a discard card that actually doesn't have negative synergy with like Soulfire and Doomguard. You can play this and then play the other card and you're fine. If you play this when you have no cards in your hand, there's just literally no drawback to playing it. People are really sleeping on this card because they're afraid of the word discard. And everyone talks so much shit about discard, but let's not forget that in One Night in Karazhan, Discard Warlock was actually a thing. People keep saying, why doesn't Blizzard realize Discard Warlock's never going to be a thing? It's already been a thing, and it was reasonably competitive. This card is fine, it might even be good. It might even be enough to carry Zoo. Drain Soul, totally not power creep over Drain Life because this can't go face. And, you know, that's how we typically used our Drain Life. It is healing for Warlock, but it's 2 mana deal 2 damage. I really don't want to play 2 mana deal 2 damage on turn 2. As a Warlock, most of the time I'd probably rather tap. It doesn't scale very well into the late game because it's only doing 2 damage. Sure, you get some healing out of it, but you're only healing for 2 and not really doing a whole lot else. You can get more healing with spell damage, but what spell damage do you want to play in Warlock? You can already draw cards with that class, so Blood Mage Thalnos is a lot less valuable, and I think most of the new spell damage cards are kinda garbage. It might be a good enough card just because Warlock cards always suck because their hero power is so good. It does have some synergy with Defile, but overall it's 2 mana deal 2 damage, I think it's pretty weak. Defile, RIP Dreadsteed. But if you want to see Warlock being viable again, maybe the sacrifice of Dreadsteed is worth it for this card, because I think this card is actually super good. Maybe even one of the best cards in the set. One of the problems with Warlock is that when you're playing against aggro, or even just a mid-range deck with a decent opener, you go turn 1 pass, turn 2 life tap, turn 3 life tap, turn 4 Hellfire, turn 5 die. But with Defile, you can actually kill their board on like turn 2, turn 3, even turn 4 without taking damage from Hellfire, and then you can actually make it to turn 5 without dying against aggro. And the thing about Defile is it can theoretically kill an entire board for 2 mana, and it's actually pretty difficult to play around, because if the numbers are just staggered correctly, this is just going to wipe a board on its own. If your opponent tries to like barely play around it, you can just land a Mortal Coil on something, and then suddenly their entire board dies. This card is also pretty good against Jade Druid, because it can theoretically kill all of their Jade Golems. Any card in Warlock that does damage becomes more valuable because of this, because if you can just rig the math a little bit, you can clear an entire board. There's a lot of complexity to actually playing the card, but as far as reviewing it, there's not much to say really. It's just a very cheap, very efficient board clear for Warlock. It's certainly going to be played probably as a 2-of in every control Warlock deck, unless they're playing Kazakus, I guess. And this card on its own might be enough to carry a control Warlock into being viable. Unwilling Sacrifice. Kill one of your dudes to cast Deadly Shot. So if you look at this and Sanguine Reveler, you're like, wow, Warlock is getting some kill your own stuff synergy, but this is not an aggro card, Sanguine Reveler is, so they don't even end up in the same deck. If you're casting this on anything bigger than a 1/1, it's probably not really worth it. Deadly Shot is already kind of a sketchy card. You can cast this on Devilsaur Egg, which is pretty sick, but I think that's really the only good positive point of synergy with this. As a Warlock, you already have access to Blast Crystal Potion and Siphon Soul. Those cards, of course, do have their negatives over this, but at least you can guarantee to kill what you want. I mean, imagine playing this against Paladin, they slam their Tyrion or their Ragnaros or something, you sacrifice your 2/2 minion or whatever, or even, let's say the Dream, you sacrifice a 1/1, and bam, you killed a Silverhand Recruit. Card is just way too unreliable, not enough synergy. Hot garbage. Despicable Dreadlord. As a 5-mana 4/5, you need the text on this card to be pretty good, but you don't need it to be completely ridiculous. At the end of your turn, deal 1 damage to all enemy minions. So this could be a pretty good control Warlock card. It just gives you access to another little form of AoE. It's good at clearing up little token shitter boards. This can be used after you've cast a Defile that didn't quite get the job done, and this can finish things up. And a lot of decks are going to have a difficult time removing this, but they're also going to have to remove it. So it seems like it could be a pretty strong card in a slower Warlock deck. Also seems like it has some potential to top out a Zoo deck. 5 mana isn't ridiculously high for Zoo, but you're kind of getting up there. It can help you in other aggro matchups. Zoo always wants to have control of the board by trading efficiently, and this card helps your trades a lot. So I just think this card is really strong. It has some potential in a control deck, some potential in an aggro deck. It is a demon, which has some slight synergy in either of those. Just seems like a very reasonable, strong card. Gnome Feratu. I guess we had to talk about this card eventually, right? So it's been said over and over again why this card is trash, but I guess I will do my best to reiterate it. Removing a card from your opponent's deck means literally nothing if the game does not go to fatigue. And as a Warlock with the life tap hero power, even if games were going to fatigue, you would probably still be the one losing fatigue, even if you played double Nosferatu in the game. People make the argument, what if you play this on turn 2, you hit your opponent's Alexstrasza, and then they just can't win the game because they don't have their Alexstrasza. It might be true that the opponent can't win the game if they don't draw their Alexstrasza, but you have to keep in mind how this discarding effect works over multiple games. I didn't come prepared with an illustration, so try to just stick with me on this. Say your opponent has 5 cards in their deck, and this game they will draw 3 cards. Whether or not either of you know how many cards will be drawn this game, there is an amount of cards that will be drawn in the game. So we'll say in this example it's 3 cards. So because your opponent will see 3 cards, they will draw the top 3 cards of their deck and they will not see the last 2 cards of their deck. So you play Nosferatu, you discard the top card of their deck, and instead of drawing cards 1 through 3, they draw cards 2 through 4. So the only thing that matters is what is card number 1 and what is card number 4. Cards 2 and 3 were getting drawn either game, whether or not you played Nosferatu. Card number 5 was never getting drawn, so the difference is between card 1 and card 4. And statistically, Alexstrasza is just as likely to be card number 1 as it is to be card number 4. So for every game that you mill Alexstrasza with Nosferatu, there will be another game where they draw Alexstrasza as card number 4 because you milled card number 1 and they never had to draw it. So of course we're going to see highlight videos where someone plays Nosferatu, the opponent's Alexstrasza gets burned, camera zooms in on the Alexstrasza as it's being destroyed, air horns play, and we'll all have a good laugh. But we're never going to see a highlight where someone plays Nosferatu, it destroys the opponent's, say, Frost Nova, and then 6 turns later, the person top decks Alexstrasza. There's never going to be a highlight of that, because it's so much less in your face, no one really thinks about it. No one's thinking, oh, they drew the Alexstrasza because 6 turns ago he played Nosferatu. But mathematically, that's exactly what's happening. People like to say that when you play Nosferatu, there's like a 1 in 30 chance that it wins you the game against a combo deck or whatever. But there is also exactly a 1 in 30 chance that it causes you to lose the game, because when they normally wouldn't have gotten to that 21st card, they get to that 21st card and that's the card that they need to win the game. I've also seen the argument that this card gives information to the person that plays it. So if you're playing Zoo and you play this on turn 2, you see your opponent's Consecration, you know that's 1 less board clear that you have to play around. But that also gives information to your opponent. That's 1 less board clear that they know they have as an out, so they have to play with that in mind. I really don't think that's ever going to be relevant. There's also the argument that you don't give up anything to play this because it's a 2-mana 2-3, but when was the last time you put a 2-mana 2-3 in your deck? A 2-mana 2-3 is not good enough for Constructed unless it does something else, and Nosferatu does not do something else. So what you're giving up is the possibility of putting a real 2-drop in your deck, basically. I hope I was able to articulate everything properly. Maybe I should make a separate video on why this card sucks and use like pretty pictures and things. Because this card sucks. It's a 2-mana 2-3. Treachery, 3 mana, choose a friendly minion and give it to your opponent. Hearthstone really doesn't have enough cards that work with this for it to see play. You can use it with Doomsayer, it's kind of comparable to Frost Nova Doomsayer. But part of the power of Frost Nova Doomsayer is that they also can't develop for the next turn. You don't have to risk your Doomsayer dying, but if their whole board's frozen, it's not very often that the Doomsayer can be dealt with. Also, Frost Nova has much more use outside of that combo than Treachery does. You can also give your opponent a Howl Fiend and try to mill them with Spreading Madness, but at best you're discarding 3 or 4 cards from them, you're spending 3 cards on that combo, you're giving your opponent probably like a 3-3, and you just paid 9 mana to pass your turn and go 3 for 3 with the opponent. So if I'm trying to grind to Legend and you queue into me, please play Howl Fiend Treachery. It actually blows my mind that when Howl Fiend was released, people were actually talking about how the only use for that card was with Treachery, when it's complete garbage with Treachery, but it works in Zoo. I don't understand people, man. But yeah, basically this card doesn't have enough synergy right now. The synergies it does have just aren't strong enough. And if you don't have very specific combos with this card, it actually does nothing, so pretty bad card. Blood Queen Lana'thel, one of Warlock's legendaries, and this card is pretty good. So 5 mana 1/6 lifesteal, if you can get it up to a 3/6, I think it's pretty worth it. Warlock is the class that enjoys the lifesteal mechanic the most because they're so often taking so much damage, they have to life tap and spend life doing that. So every point of healing they can get is very valuable. My initial problem with this card is that it's a control card. You don't want to play this in Zoo because you don't really care about lifesteal that much. It's a control card that wants you to discard to have synergy with it, and I thought that control discard Warlock would never be a thing, but Bloodreaver Gul'dan has changed my mind, and I think this card makes a lot of sense in exactly the Bloodreaver Gul'dan deck. So if you can discard 2 cards with this, 5 mana 3/6 lifesteal, I think Warlock would probably play a 5 mana 3/6 lifesteal. There's always the potential that it's even better than that, so I think since you can reliably get it to that point, and it can be even better, it's a pretty good card. So here's Bloodreaver Gul'dan. He's kind of like N'Zoth except for your demons, and the benefit of getting demons instead of death rattles is that you can get guaranteed taunts with your Lakari Fellhounds, you can get chargers with Doom Guards, so you have things that affect the board immediately and stop you from dying. In Warlock especially, you really appreciate that 5 armor. The hero power change is especially good for Warlock. Some of the other Death Knights, the hero power change is like a slight upgrade, or maybe even a side grade. But in Warlock, it's doubly good. Once you get to the point in the game where you can afford to play this 10 mana card, you've probably life tapped enough, you might not even necessarily want to be drawing too many more cards from your deck anyway, and at that point in the game, you're starting to value your health total quite a bit more, so you want to get rid of life tap anyway. You'd replace it with probably any other hero's hero power at that point in the game if you could, and you get this really OP hero power, Siphon Life, deal 3 damage and it has lifesteal, so it keeps you alive, which is something that Warlocks really want. You get to remove things from the board. 2 mana deal 3 damage is absolutely disgusting. So it helps you control the board, helps you not die, puts a lot of stuff on your board so you can kill your opponent. Seems like a really, really solid card. So problems with this card, they cost 10 mana, and if Warlock still sucks, it's going to be hard to get to turn 10 as a Warlock. And if you're close to dying, you're only getting 5 armor this turn. You're not going to also be able to use the hero power for another 3 healing. But like I said, I think you're probably playing Doomguard and Lakari Fellhound, maybe even Voidwalker in this deck. So those are defensive options that can help keep you alive alongside the armor. It's also just kind of weird for Warlock to get a new hero card when they already have Jaraxxus, which functions in kind of a similar way and is one of Warlock's best cards. So is this card better than Jaraxxus? I think maybe you just play it alongside Jaraxxus, because to support this guy I think you do have to be playing some of the discard demons, simply because you want to resurrect a bunch of demons. Those are the best ones and they're the only defensive ones. If you're just getting back like Flame Imps and shit, you're not really that happy about that. So you probably just play this alongside Jaraxxus, that way if either one of these gets discarded, you still have the other one as a backup plan. They're both very strong late game cards on their own. You can also play this in the Lakari Sacrifice deck, but the main problem with that is Lakari Sacrifice is garbage, one of the worst cards in the game. I don't think this or any of the Warlock cards really do anything to change that. When you play this, you'd rather be summoning significant demons instead of 3/2 shitters. Also, with the Nether Portal being on the board, that makes the Battlecry from this guy worse. So I think if Bloodreaver Gul'dan is a deck, it's not going to play Lakari Sacrifice. Not because Bloodreaver Gul'dan isn't a good card, but because Lakari Sacrifice is one of the worst cards in the game. So Warlock is actually kind of an interesting class to evaluate. They got one of the best cards in the set with Defile. They got 3 of the worst cards in the set. But they also got a lot of pretty solid options. They got 2 Zoo cards. I'm not sure if Sanguine Reveler really even makes it into that list, but Howlfiend probably does, maybe even Despicable Dreadlord. But what I'm really looking at for Warlock in this expansion is the Bloodreaver Gul'dan deck that plays Blood Queen Lana'thel. I think that's really the big new archetype that they get, and I think between that and Zoo, those are the only decks that are potentially going to save Warlock in this expansion. Warrior is one of the better classes in Journey to Un'Goro. It's pretty much always been one of the better classes. Right now they have Pirate Warrior and Taunt Warrior. I'm personally not a big fan of either of those decks, so I'm hoping they get the cards to support a new archetype. First up we have Bloodraiser. I guess I'll just get this out of the way and say I think this is the best Warrior card in the expansion. It's a little reminiscent of Deathspite, which is probably in the conversation for one of the best cards ever printed. This is no Deathspite, but being comparable to Deathspite is pretty good when Deathspite is such a strong card. It's easy to look at this and say, 4 mana weapon with 2 power, yikes, keep that away from me. But you have to keep in mind that the front and back half of this both have a whirlwind strapped onto it, so the thing you're hitting with your weapon is actually going to be taking 3 damage with either of those attacks. And then you've got the Whirlwind effect, which on its own can clear out enemy shitters. You can combo it with Ravaging Ghoul for a 2-mana AoE, or Sleep with the Fishes for a 4 damage AoE. Combine it with Armorsmith to gain a ton of armor, draw a card with Acolyte of Pain. The weapon on its own is very strong, has a lot of good synergy in Warrior. Absolutely this card will see play if there's a slower Warrior deck running around. I think Pirate Warrior probably doesn't play this card because it doesn't hit face hard enough. They have enough weapons and the Whirlwind can't affect their own board negatively. So Pirate Warrior probably doesn't want this. Maybe a Tempo Warrior could play this, especially with some of the new synergy cards. I think Control Warrior will absolutely love this card. And even Quest Warrior probably plays this, because it has a lot of the same cards as Control Warrior, and that deck also plays Primordial Drake, and that makes Primordial Drake a 3 damage AoE instead of 2. Card is super, super good. Animated Berserker is a 1-mana 1/3, so it's pretty reasonable. You're never playing this card in Pirate Warrior because it's going to kill a lot of your things and you don't have too much synergy. You're probably never playing this in Control Warrior because you don't really care about having a 1-drop in that deck, and I don't feel like you can really get that much value out of the text on this card. You can draw a card with Acolyte of Pain, sure. You don't really want to be gaining an armor with Armorsmith with this because it's just not nearly efficient enough for what Armorsmith wants to do. There are some other things you can do with this in Control Warrior, but I don't think they really want this card that much. So I think the place for this deck is probably in some kind of new Tempo Warrior that we haven't seen yet. It has a little bit of synergy with Frothing Berserker, it works with Valkyr Soulclaimer, which we'll see in a minute. Maybe you can even play like Amani Berserker, but would you even play a 2-mana 5/2 in your deck? I think that's arguable. If you have some synergies with this card, it's strong, mostly because it's a 1-mana 1/3, and it does have the potential to get some upside, but even in the decks that have a lot of synergy with this card, they will probably also be playing cards that you don't want to hit with this, which is kind of awkward. Also notable in Warrior, if your 2-drop doesn't want to be played with this, you just play Fiery War Axe instead. Seems like an okay card in the right deck, might be kind of hard to find that right deck though. Forge of Souls. During release season, I usually hang around in the competitive Hearthstone subreddit and see what the people there are saying about the new cards as they're released to kind of get a feel for them. If you do the same thing on the main Hearthstone Reddit, you get a bunch of rank 20 players that don't know what they're talking about. If you do it in the competitive HS subreddit, you at least get the rank 10 players that kind of know what they're talking about. So I'm not really sure what the consensus on this card is now, but when it was released, I think people were overwhelmingly positive about this card. I even saw one person who said this was the first card in the set that really made them take a step back and say, whoa, this card is strong. And the whole time I'm just sitting there looking at this card and I'm like, this card sucks. So it's 2-mana draw 2 weapons from your deck. I think people are really tempted to just see 2-mana draw 2 and kind of ignore what the rest of the text is. Compared to Arcane Intellect, it looks super efficient. But the problem is you're drawing 2 weapons, which inherently means that you're probably going to get to use one of those cards that turn, but you're not going to get to use the other card that turn or even the following turn. So it's like draw 1 card now and draw another card 2 turns from now. And if one of the cards you're drawing is Gorehowl, then maybe it's draw 1 card now, draw another card in 5 turns or something, and that becomes significantly less appealing. Now that Warrior has Blood Razor, you can like equip it and destroy it, and then you get a 2 damage AoE and a Fiery War Axe charge or something, but that's really not that efficient. I think people are tempted to see how good Fiery War Axe is on turn 2, and just assume that it's a really good card throughout the whole game. It certainly doesn't fall off as hard as a lot of other 2-cost cards, but if I'm playing Control Warrior, I really don't want a Fiery War Axe on turn 10 most of the time. So what weapons are you actually trying to draw with this? Fiery War Axe, Blood Razor, those are probably going to be in every Warrior deck, but I'm not sure how good those even are with this card. If you're playing a Control Warrior, you can also play Gorehowl, but in the Journey to Un'Goro meta, weapon removal has been everywhere, and I really don't think that's going to change because Pirate Warrior is probably still going to be good. People still want to play patches, so Bloodsail Corsair is going to be in a lot of decks. At least a couple of the new Death Knights give really ridiculous weapons, so weapon destruction probably even goes up in value a little bit. Not to mention I think they printed like 4 or 5 just straight up weapon cards in the set. So I don't think you can really afford to even play a bigger weapon like Gorehowl because it's just going to get removed. So what is Forge of Souls actually doing for you? Turn 10, draw Fiery War Axe and Blood Razor. Cool. Seems super underwhelming to me. You could also play this in Pirate Warrior to dig for your Arcanite Reaper. Arcanite Reaper is typically one of the cards that you really want around the end turns of the game. But what are you cutting for this? The worst card in Pirate Warrior right now is Mortal Strike. Mortal Strike is 4 mana deal 4 or sometimes 4 mana deal 6. If you're playing Forge of Souls to dig for your Arcanite Reaper, it's 7 mana deal 5. A lot of times you're wanting to close out the game before turn 7 anyway. And as a Pirate Warrior, if you have another card in your hand that does something, you're always playing that before Forge of Souls. And I think any turn that you could play Forge of Souls and equip an Arcanite Reaper is probably the last turn of the game, so I don't think you're going to be able to get the second swing out of the Arcanite Reaper most of the time. So in Pirate Warrior, I think it's too slow. You can use this to increase the reliability of drawing your Fiery War Axe in the early turns, which is where Fiery War Axe really shines. But Fiery War Axe is by far at its best on turn 2, so if you're playing Forge of Souls turn 2 instead, then it's not nearly as powerful. You can coin this out on turn 1 to get your Fiery War Axe, but again, you'd much rather just be coining out a Fiery War Axe. Are you ever going to keep this card in your hand if you don't have the Fiery War Axe? I feel like a lot of times you'd rather just mulligan it and try to actually draw the War Axe. If Warrior gets a cool new weapon in the next expansion that you really want to be drawing every game, I can see this card seeing play, but right now I think this card actually sucks. Mountain Fire Armor. I really don't like this Death Rattle if it's your opponent's turn thing, because all these minions have poor stats, and generally with these really attack-heavy minions, you want the option of trading with them, and you're not going to get their Death Rattles if you're the one making the trades. If you're not getting the Death Rattle out of this card, it's a 3 mana 4/3, which is not good enough to put in your deck. And what deck are you putting a 3 mana 4/3 into? Probably an aggro deck. So even if you get the Death Rattle, do you even care about gaining 6 armor? It seems like there are conflicting things going on with this card, and I don't really see a deck where I would ever want to play this. Maybe if Shield Slam could go face. Valkyr Soul Claimer. So you have to survive damage to get a 2/2. You do that once, you have a 1/3 and a 2/2. Doesn't really seem that much better than maybe even like a Razorfin Hunter or something like that. If you're putting this into play with an animated Berserker, maybe it's okay. If you want to get more value out of it after that, if you try to play a Whirlwind, then your first ghoul is getting damaged. With only 1 power, the main body of this card doesn't fight very well. A lot of times it's just going to get 1 shot, even at 4 health. A lot of times it's just going to die without ever summoning any ghouls. I think you need to get more than 1 ghoul out of this card, and I think it's too hard to get more than 1, and also pretty common that you wouldn't get any. So card seems like it's pretty bad. Death Revenant. It seems really hard for me to imagine a situation where this card is ever better to have in your deck than Sea Giant or Frostwolf Warlord. There are like sweet spots and little advantages to having this instead of either of those cards. Compared to Frostwolf Warlord, it counts opponent's minions. Compared to Sea Giant, you don't need quite as many minions on the board for it to be playable. But at the end of the day, this is just a pile of stats. You need it to definitely be better than a 5/5 for it to be worthwhile. Even at a 6/6, I think it's questionably worthwhile, and I think getting it up to a 6/6 reliably would be pretty difficult. It's just a pile of stats. That's probably not good enough. Bring It On is 2 mana, gain a shitload of armor. So the value of gaining a shitload of armor is that sometimes you play it and then the opponent can't kill you anymore, which is pretty nice. And historically, I think almost every armor card Warrior has gotten has seen play, but most of them also do something other than give you armor. But Bring It On also gives you a lot more armor than most of those cards. This can be the kind of card that on its own just beats Freeze Mages, if you don't feel like putting Armor Smiths in your deck. But particularly with new cards like Bloodrazor, Armor Smith probably goes up in value quite a bit. Or maybe you just want to be super redundant with your armor and just gain a shitload of armor every game. If there are a lot of 10 or 12 health minions in the meta, comboing this with Shield Slam can do a lot of work. I think it's easy to write this card off since it only gains armor, but it gains a lot of armor, and gaining a lot of armor can be pretty good in some situations. It does also have that drawback of reducing the cost of minions in your opponent's hand, but Warrior plays Brawl, they play Sleep with the Fishes. You're probably never casting this on like turn 2. Most of the time when you play this, your opponent's hand is probably going to be fairly small anyway, but there is certainly some danger to playing this against a combo deck. I suspect this will be at best a one-of, but in the specific metagame where you'd want to play this card, 10 mana gain 10 armor can be pretty insane. Seems like a reasonable consideration for a Control Warrior. Dead Man's Hand. As much as I like this card, I think it's probably not very good. fatigue hasn't really been a relevant factor in most games for a while, and I think Blizzard is consciously making the decision to make most games not go to fatigue, because most casual players probably don't think it's very fun. I enjoy it when my games go to fatigue, but Blizzard doesn't care about me. So not only does this card put more cards in your deck for fatigue, but if you're playing 2 copies of Dead Man's Hand, you can use one to shuffle the other into your deck, and then when you draw that, you shuffle the first one into your deck. So you basically just never run out of cards in your deck. It's kind of like Jade Druid, except it's much slower and you don't run out of threats. The thing with Jade Druid is they can go threat, threat, shuffle, threat, threat, shuffle, and their threats just keep getting bigger. If you're playing Dead Man's Hand with a threat, then you're going to go Dead Man's Hand, threat, Dead Man's Hand, threat. So you have dead turns every other turn, whereas they have 2 bombs and then 1 dead turn every 3 turns. So against Jade Druid, it's probably not going to help you. If you're concerned about Jade Druid, you're just going to play Skulking Geist instead. And Jade Druid has a lot of card draw, so you don't need to never run out of cards against them. Once you've dealt with their Jade idols, your normal fatigue options are plenty. But if we ever do find ourselves in the metagame where fatigue is relevant, this card can be pretty good. But even in the old days of Control Warrior, you could still lose games if you just didn't have your threats at the right time and your opponent did. Even though those matchups often went to fatigue, they still could be won or lost based on tempo, and Dead Man's Hand is 2 mana do nothing until you get near fatigue. Kind of reminiscent of Gang Up, which never really saw play in Rogue, because shuffling more cards into your deck doesn't matter until you're out of cards. But I think if I've thought about this properly, you can play Fatigue Warrior if you play 2 Dead Man's Hand, and you have a Cold Light Oracle and another relevant card. And then when that's your hand, you play Dead Man's Hand, you shuffle another Dead Man's Hand, Cold Light Oracle, and I think you want something else to go into your deck too, so you have those 3 cards in your deck. You play your Cold Light Oracle, you draw 2 of those 3 cards, and then by your next turn you've drawn the 3rd, so your hand again is exactly 2 Dead Man's Hand, Cold Light Oracle, and that 3rd card. So every turn you can make your opponent get 2 cards deeper in fatigue, and you never get deeper in fatigue. I don't think you can go faster than that because you do have to spend mana on Dead Man's Hand and Cold Light Oracle, but that could be an interesting way to finish games as a Control Warrior. But anyway, unless fatigue becomes relevant, this card is not going to be very good because it's 2 mana do nothing. Interesting card though. Rotface. The thing about this card is that random legendary minions really aren't nearly as strong as you might think. In this set we got the new princes, which are garbage. There's always Cho and Peggle and the normal list of shitters that you always had to be worried about with Sneedsold Shredder and that kind of stuff. And even if you do get something pretty good, this guy is an 8 mana 4/6, he has to survive damage, so he's an 8 mana 4/5. So you need your average result to probably be worth like at least 5 mana. And the games where you get Lore Walker Cho, you're just going to lose the game because of that. So you probably need multiple hits out of this card, but then if you're getting multiple hits out of this card, you're going to probably have to invest some type of whirlwind effects to get those. And then when your opponent AoEs you, they kind of broke even. It's not really that big a deal. I feel like most of the time I would rather just play a real fat legendary in my deck than Rotface and hope that I get a fat legendary. There's also some potential that you draw this card without having a Bloodrazor setup or something like that. And then it's an 8 mana 4/6 and your opponent one-shots it, you don't get a single legendary out of it. Seems like a Control Warrior, even one that has the Whirlwind synergy needed to go with this card, probably has better options at that stage in the game. And our final class card, Scourgelord Garrosh. So the weapon you get from this is pretty sick. It's kind of like an AoE, and when you combine it with your hero power, it's kind of like a 5 damage AoE. But some things survive that. You do have to take damage using your weapon with this guy. And normally warriors don't mind taking damage using their weapons, but if you're playing this you are giving up your armor up hero power, so you do need to start worrying about how much damage you're taking from using the weapon. You do also have to worry about your opponent just playing Harrison Jones the turn after you equip your weapon. But the weapon is good and the hero power is good, dealing 1 damage to everything. There's your Rotface combo, I guess. You can draw cards with Acolyte, gain a bunch of armor, trigger for things like Sudden Genesis and Blood Warrior. This card might actually be kind of sick in Blood Warrior, but I'm not sure if you really want. But I think a lot of the Blood Warrior decks I've seen like cap out at 3 mana other than their giants. Not sure if this card really fits in there. You can also just use the 1 damage AoE to kill your opponent's board. really good at killing tokens. Paladin has typically had a pretty good matchup against Warrior, because they could just make a dude every turn, and then Warrior could never actually deal with all of them. But now Paladins can just make 2/2s instead of 1/1s. I guess you can only kill them every other turn. But that is a built-in way that Warrior doesn't have to worry about getting one turn killed by the Paladin hero power. Or I guess not really one turn killed, but killed from a high life total. And this of course also procs things like Sleep with the Fishes and Execute, which is definitely pretty relevant. Maybe after you play this guy you want to start playing Dead Man's Hand with Executes, and normally if you did that you'd eventually run out of Execute activators, this way you never do. Could be a thing, I guess. But you do give up your armor, which I've said a few times, but I think it's pretty important that you're giving up your armor. Not only does that mean that your opponent can actually burn you out at that point, it makes your shield slams a lot worse, but also you just have to think, is this really better than another 8, 9, or 10 drop I could be playing in a normal control warrior? If I want to control warrior with a finisher, which this is kind of a finisher, why am I not just playing Fire Plume's Heart? It seems like kind of an awkward card. There are certainly games where if you get this down it's going to be very good, but there are probably going to be other times where you don't even really want to play this. I don't know. I think it's an okay Death Knight, but I'm not sure how many advantages it really has over, say, N'Zoth in a more traditional control warrior, or Fire Plume's Heart in a quest control warrior. So if I'm evaluating these cards right, Warrior got a lot of garbage. Like 6 cards that are probably unplayable, 1 card that really needs the right metagame, and Bring It On, 1 card that is gonna need a weird tempo deck to spawn. Scourgelord Garrosh is a pretty questionable card in my opinion. I think Bloodrazor is really the only great card that Warrior's got in this expansion. But they can still just play Pirates and go face, so I think Warrior will probably still be fine.